Okay. So welcome to tonight's meeting organised by Socialist Party Scotland. This is about our new book launch, which is Scotland and the National Question, a Marxist Approach. We're going to be getting started in a few minutes. I'm just going to allow some more people to join the meeting before we kick off with the speakers that we have on the agenda tonight. So just give everyone a few more minutes to join in. Okay, great to see so many people who've already joined us on the Zoom call. As I said earlier, we've got people from all over the UK, Scotland, England, Ireland, and further afield. Well, in Ireland, sorry, and also Wales. So we also have our Facebook Live post at the moment. So I'm sure there'll be a few people joining on that to hear about our new book. Just give it another minute and then I'll introduce the speakers. As I said, for those of you who haven't bought the book, the link is in the chat, and on Facebook Live it'll be in the Facebook Live chat as well, for anybody who wants to buy our book. Still more people joining, which is great to see. Okay. Okay, we'll get started now with the meeting. I just want to introduce myself firstly. I'm Leah Ganley and I'm a member of Socialist Party Scotland in the Highlands, so part of the Highlands and Islands branch, and I'll be chairing this evening's meeting, which we're here to talk about the launch of our new book, which is on the national question. So it's Scotland and the National Question, a Marxist Approach. We launched this this week, and it's something that has been something we've been planning for a little while, but we decided that now was the right time to publish a book on this subject. So why are we thinking that, you know, right now it's a good time, and why is there a need to discuss the national question at the moment? Well, firstly, I think it's never been support for independence has never been higher. In the last sort of 12 opinion polls that have been conducted, independence is showing as a majority for support, and each time we have another poll, we see independence, the support for independence is increasing, and I think that there's building up a massive confrontation between the Scottish working class, who the majority voted and supported independence in the 2014 election, and even more have come on board to support it since then. But a confrontation between the working class and the Scottish and the UK government, and particularly led by Boris Johnson, who's indicated that he does not want to support another indie ref, and has put that across very clearly. As I've said, there's been a lot of support for independence. 64% of people in Scotland support indie ref 2, and a colossal 79% of 16 to 24-year-olds currently back independence. So we think that now is really the time for that kind of discussion. So we are going to be having two speakers tonight. One is Philip Stott, who is the Scottish Secretary of Socialist Party Scotland, who is the main author of this book. He'll be speaking first, and then we're delighted to have a video that's been created earlier today, recorded by Peter Taff, who's the political secretary of Socialist Party England and Wales, and was the editor of the Militant newspaper, the forerunner of the Socialist paper, and we'll be hearing from him a little bit later on in the meeting, and then we'll be opening up the room for discussion. So if anyone's got any questions that they want to ask, or any comments, then we'll have time for that. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Philip Stott, who, as I said, he's the National Secretary of Socialist Party Scotland, and he's one of the main contributory authors to this book. So I'm just going to pass you over to Philip first of all.
Thanks very much, Leah. And can I thank everybody for attending the meeting this evening. I want to, of course, thank those who helped in the production of the book. I want to thank particularly Mary Dominguez, who assisted so heroically with the layout and the front cover and the back cover of the book that you can probably see behind me. And of course, the contributing authors, Peter Taff, who you'll hear from shortly, Niall Mulholland, who contributed a chapter on Ireland and the national question, and Dave Reid, who you'll also hear from later on, who wrote an article from the question of the national question and how it impacts on Wales. So why have we produced this book, and why have we produced it now? In part, the book examines the position that Socialist Party Scotland and Militant has taken on the national question in Scotland over decades. And partly that's to see if it stands up to scrutiny. In other words, are we able to reproduce our material and stand over what it says, the analysis and our programme of how we have linked the struggle for democratic rights for the people of Scotland to the struggle for socialist change. And this is in part what our book covers. I think it's important for the new generation that they know the history and the approach that Militant and then the Socialist Party have taken on the national question. Because Socialist Party Scotland and our forerunner Militant, as far back as 1979, supported demands for a Scottish Assembly, and we campaigned for the idea of fighting for socialism across Britain with autonomy for Scotland. Almost 2 decades later, in 1997, we were involved in the campaign to support the creation of the Scottish Parliament, but at the same time we warned of its extreme limitations in terms of the powers that it had to impact and change the lives of working class communities. In 2014, during the first independence referendum, that we described as a working class uprising against austerity and the political establishment, we participated and we pioneered the case and the socialist case for independence to a mass audience. Unlike many on the left in Scotland, we did not give uncritical support to the SNP-led campaign. Let's not forget, as it's the case today, and it was in 2014, the leadership of the Scottish National Party defend and support capitalism. And therefore, what we did in 2014 was to give critical support to a yes vote, but we clearly set out the need to fight for an independent socialist Scotland. And of course, we didn't leave it there. We stand for the unity of the working class in Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland in the context of a voluntary and free, democratic, socialist confederation. The SNP leaders, as we know today, defend capitalism. They want an independent Scotland to carry on with class exploitation, with poverty, with inequality. In fact, in power, in Holyrood, and in local government, the SNP, while they are very successful electorally, have implemented Tory cuts to the penny. During the COVID crisis, the SNP-led government has undoubtedly performed better than Boris Johnson, but that bar is very, very low. Nevertheless, our conclusion is that the Scottish government under the leadership of the SNP have failed on COVID. They've failed on schools where COVID has spread among school staff, among pupils, with thousands and thousands forced to self-isolate as a result of the decision to put the schools back. And we very much welcome the decision of the Teachers' Union, the EIS in Glasgow and Western Bartonshire, to today begin a balloting process towards industrial disputes and potentially industrial action in the new year to make schools safe. The SNP government was slow to respond as the pandemic approached. They failed on care homes. They failed on the students going back to halls or residences where COVID spread like wildfire, and on many other issues. In other words, our analysis, if you like, of the SNP leadership is they have no answers for the working class, not just on austerity, on cuts and COVID, but no answers really for the struggle for self-determination and the struggle for democratic rights against the Tory government. So an explanation of our record in the national question we thought was worthwhile. And it's why in this book we've included our material going back decades for the analysis and the programme that we put forward in relation to the national question in Scotland. However, another burning reason for producing this book today, and at this time, is because of what is coming down the tracks. Because what will happen in 2021 and beyond is, as Leah touched on, a major confrontation is set to erupt over the right to have a second independence referendum, where the working class in its overwhelming majority back that demand, and between them and a Tory government who are hell set on trying to ensure that that democratic right is not given to the people of Scotland, and particularly to the working class of Scotland itself. Support for independence has risen markedly during the COVID pandemic. Leah gave the figures of the number of young people who now back independence, with almost 80% of 16 to 24-year-olds in favour of an independent Scotland, with an average in the polls now of 56% who now back independence among the population as a whole. A majority among the working class and a majority among those under the age of 55 overwhelmingly back Scottish independence as well. And it reflects mass anger at the living conditions of working class communities the length and breadth of Scotland, with young people facing devastating attacks on education, on the lack of jobs, on poverty pay, and the potential for an explosion in mass unemployment as the furlough scheme ends in March. And as we predicted, 2014, the first IndyRef, would not settle the matter for a generation at all. It would quickly be followed by demands for another referendum and to carry on the fight to try to win self-determination for Scotland. And that is precisely what has happened over the past period. And there is little doubt right now that if a referendum was held in the post-COVID conditions of austerity, of an unprecedented economic crisis facing capitalism, of the pauperisation of the working class, there would almost certainly be a majority today in Scotland in favour of Scottish independence. And for that reason, not just Boris Johnson, lying Boris, not just the Tories and all their incompetent governments, but the capitalist class as a whole have turned their face against conceding a second so-called legal independence referendum. They did agree to one in 2014 when David Cameron was the Prime Minister. They were convinced they would inflict a defeat that would settle the matter for generations. And even then, even in 2014, they were forced to unleash a ferocious campaign called Project Fear, where big business, the capitalist establishment, were brought out to rain hell and thunder down on the idea of independence in relation to Scotland. Internationally, we remember Barack Obama, the Premier of China, the Pope, the Orange Order, the Queen, all made it be known they were opposed to Scottish independence. And even then, in September 2014, 1.6 million people voted in favour of independence. It forced the Financial Times newspaper to describe that experience as a near-death experience for British capitalism. And as we pointed out immediately after the referendum, the winners, the so-called capitalist establishment, the right wing of the Labour Party and the Tories, the winners soon became the losers. And the losers soon became the winners. We saw the decimation of the Scottish Labour Party, who were seen to have sided with the capitalist establishment, and saw them absolutely eviscerated in the general election in 2015. And they've never recovered their electoral base by turning their back on the democratic demands of the working class in Scotland. But today, in 2020, and as we enter 2021, the world has shifted on its axis. We're in the midst of this global economic tsunami and a terrifying pandemic. The Tory government is racked with division and turmoil over Brexit and the other issues that it faces. There is no possibility of an agreed process for a second independence referendum being given by the Tory government. So how will the fight for self-determination be achieved? Certainly not under the leadership of the SNP. Sturgeon et al. Believe that the ruling class will agree to a second referendum if they see a majority have voted for it in May 2021 during the Scottish elections. But there's too much at stake. They want to prevent the breakup of the UK at all costs. While they can offer a few carrots, a few crumbs off the table and talk about more powers for Scotland, it will mainly be the stick of the denial of democratic rights and the determination to whip up a campaign of opposition to a second INDRF. Our book that is now being produced, its starting point is that this is a struggle, yes, for democratic rights, yes, for self-determination, but above all, it's a struggle against capitalism and the interests of capitalism itself. It's a fight for the right to decide, but it's intimately bound up with a movement against the profit system and all those who stand against the democratic right to choose in Scotland. And we cannot avoid the conclusion. And the SNP leaders and many sections of the left in Scotland are precisely guilty of this. To think that you can win independence first by postponing the class struggle, by postponing the struggle for socialism, to think that that is a way forward is an absolute dead end. No, the key to winning democratic rights in Scotland is precisely through the class struggle and the struggle for socialism. Nicola Sturgeon et al. See only one road, an agreement with the capitalist class so that they accept a transition to independence. And on the contrary, Socialist Party Scotland, and in our book, we argue clearly and unashamedly for a mass mobilisation of the working class, with the trade unions playing a leading role that will be needed to secure a referendum. That struggle is the same struggle that is required to defend jobs against a new round of austerity and to ensure that the working class don't pay for the COVID crisis. So why don't the SNP say, for example, that if Westminster refused to allow a second INDRF, The Scottish Parliament will organise the referendum anyway if Westminster refuses. Why not call on the trade unions to organise mass industrial action in defence of the right to decide? Why not call for working class communities to come out onto the streets to protest, to demand democratic rights? Why not call on school students, on college and university students to organise occupation and mass protest in favour of a second independence referendum? Why do the SNP leadership want to avoid this at all costs? Well, one of the reasons, and not least of those reasons, is that they are absolutely wedded to the idea that an independent Scotland would rejoin the European Union. And what was the role of the European Union in Catalonia in 2017 when the Catalan working class demanded the right to have an independent republic? It was the European Union that sided with the Madrid government, that supported de facto the brutal putting down of the movement for self-determination in Catalonia. And the SNP's vision of an independence capitalist Scotland is absolutely based on being part of the boss's European Union and the interests of European capitalism. But there's another reason why the SNP leaders' support for capitalism is a dead end, and that is their Growth Commission report, which in Scotland many people have discussed and debated in the independence movement. It's still the official policy of the SNP to adopt a programme economically that would mean austerity cuts for a decade after independence. In the words of Kate Forbes, the current, if you like, finance minister for the Scottish government, when she said just 2 weeks ago, we will have to balance the books under independence. The problem is they want to balance the books at the expense of the jobs and the wages and the living conditions of working class communities. Therefore, they fear an aroused working class, preparing to fight and shape the future, not to carry on with capitalism, but they fear the possibility that the struggle for independence will morph into a struggle for fundamental socialist change. And why not? Why don't we take the wealth from the 1%? Why do we have to accept that the richest 1% in Scotland are allowed to own 50% of all the wealth in Scotland? Why don't we bring into public ownership the oil, the gas, the banks, big business under democratic working class control and management, rather than the scandal of BIFAB, the so-called rosy future for renewable energy? Why, rather than that, go to the rocks with hundreds of jobs being lost? Why don't we bring the likes of BIFAB into public ownership so we can have a publicly owned and democratically run renewable sector funded for, paid for by the profits of the fossil fuel industry, to allow a transformation in the economy to a sustainable future based on the interest of the working class for jobs and for a future? And that really goes to the heart of the book, that to resolve the national question in Scotland in this conjuncture, in the midst of this unprecedented crisis for global capitalism, means a struggle for socialism in Scotland is inextricably linked to the struggle to end capitalism and to win democratic rights. And that means confronting, it means absolutely confronting the increasingly authoritarian British and indeed world capitalism as they try to maintain their system on the bones of the working class. But it also means, crucially, building support for our movement for the working class in England, Wales and Ireland and across Europe as a whole. The capitalist class will attempt to drive divisions between workers based on nationality. They'll try to divide Scottish workers from English workers, Welsh workers from Irish workers. And the only way to confront that is to stand implacably for the unity of the working class and against all efforts at division. Yes, we are for ending the reactionary capitalist union as it exists today. But yes, we're also fighting to build instead a voluntary socialist alternative, a socialist confederation based on cooperation and solidarity, an independent socialist Scotland that would link up with a socialist England, Wales and Ireland as a step to a socialist Europe. And it's essential that we rely only on the forces of the working class under a banner of class unity to lead the struggle against capitalism and for democratic rights itself. And that means, and we touch on this in one of the chapters in our book, the need to build a new mass working class party in Scotland. And indeed that applies, frankly, in England, Wales, Ireland as well. The trade unions have to play the key role. The leaders of the trade unions, at least in their majority, need to break with the idea that there is somehow a national interest with the bosses. There is not. We fight only for class interests. We fight for the interests of the working class, and we fight for the interests of the working class, not just in Scotland, but globally as well. And that means we appeal to the trade union leaders, particularly those on the left, to take the necessary steps to build a new party in Scotland, to help lead our struggle, yes, for a second independence referendum, but also for an independent socialist Scotland and for a mass movement against capitalism itself. And that's why Socialist Party Scotland, next May, taking small but very important steps as part of the Trade Unionist and Socialist Coalition, alongside the RMT, Transport Workers Union and others, because we're standing socialist candidates in the May elections next year. We're standing in the elections on a platform to advocate, unlike the SNP leaders, to advocate the building of a mass movement for the right to indirect too, that will link that mass movement against big business and their attacks on the working class and the system of capitalism itself. So we would appeal to you, yes, buy the book, to read our analysis, to look at our ideas, not just today, but the way we've approached the national question with sensitivity, with clarity, and above all with a principled socialist programme throughout the decades, really ever since the 1970s in particular. But open up a dialogue with us to the programme, to the methods of struggle that are required to change society, not only to win the right to decide, but for a socialist future, because we need to end once and for all the destructive capitalism and all of the misery it represents for the overwhelming majority of the working class and the oppressed. That is the struggle for socialism. That is the struggle to defeat capitalism, not in one country, but across the globe. Join us in that fight. Join us in that struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for that fantastic introduction, and really gives a flavour of some of the topics that are going to be discussed in the book, and a reminder of how big 2014 was really in terms of Scottish recent political history, and the impact that it had on consciousness and the development of the sort of mood around the national question in particular, and how that hasn't gone away, and it's certainly intensified. And I think, as Philip's picked up on, the issue is about the approach that needs to be taken to actually win independence, and to have a serious approach to that, and some of the methods that we would pick up on the other organisations and bodies such as the SNP wouldn't, in terms of just relying on referendums and not actually mass action. Okay, so I'm going to just introduce the next speaker. As I said, it's Peter Taff, who we don't actually have as a speaker, but he has done a recording for us, which we'll be able to play very shortly. So it's just to say that we're delighted that Peter Taff could record this for us earlier today for this really important meeting, and he's been one of the foremost Marxists since the 1960s, with an outstanding contribution to the theoretical development of Trotskyism, and not least of all on our policy around the national question, which was a key reason why we've included Peter's contribution on Scotland in the book. Peter's also a co-founder of the Committee for a Workers' International, which is the international organisation that Socialist Party Scotland is affiliated to. So I'm just going to pass over to Philip, I think, who's going to set the video. Is that okay, Philip?
CWI and the Socialist, formerly militant, has a proud record in fighting for the full rights, national rights of self-determination and all of that goes with it. This is particularly true in relation to the closest countries to England or Britain, that is Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And we have to remember that this is not a specifically socialist demand, the right of self-determination. In fact, it is part of the incomplete bourgeois democratic revolution which really developed in Europe in the century between the French Revolution and the end of the 19th century. The incomplete bourgeois democratic revolution meant that the formation of European nation states had not been completed in all cases. In many countries it had, but had not been completed in all cases by the time that century ended. And therefore, we inherited, that is the working class, the labour movement, socialists and Marxists, this problem with the working class at the same time fighting against capitalism and for a change in society. But it's always been there. Sometimes it's been a major issue pushed to the forefront. Sometimes it's a secondary issue, or appears to be a secondary issue. Nevertheless, there was an upsurge in the national question in Ireland, which is Britain's oldest colony, really in the 1960s, 1950s and 1960s. And what are the demands raised in this problem? The right of self-determination, of course, for each country, which was incomplete in the case of Ireland because the country was divided with Northern Ireland as a different entity. And that resulted in inevitable upheavals once the working people and the labour movements got on the move. In Scotland, we had a base, really, in that country, even before we developed a base in Ireland, and that also had an incomplete bourgeois capitalist revolution. This represented the failure of British capitalism to carry through the tasks of their own revolution, which is a land reform, which is the development of a nation state, so on and so forth. And with that, of course, a strong working class. Scotland was always an important base for us, almost from the beginning of our struggles in Britain. It was also a country of a powerful working class with enormous social tendencies or socialist tendencies with John Maclean, the Clydesiders, so on and so forth. And therefore, we had a base in Scotland before we had it in Ireland. However, with the upsurge in the movement of peoples in the 1960s, which was part of a worldwide process of the reawakening of a new generation, Ireland came to the forefront. And I visited Ireland in 1968, 1969, and from that time up to the present day, Ireland has been a very important base for the ideas of militant, the ideas of the Socialist Party itself. I visited in 1968-69, and actually I stayed with a young contact that we had who came from a Protestant background, not a Catholic background, that was the main force driving the movement in Ireland at that particular time. And it was nevertheless a very fruitful period because there were a number against the background, for instance, of the upheavals, particularly in the city of Derry. Derry and Belfast were the two main areas of struggle at that particular time. I made contact with people like Cathy Harkin and of others, of people like Bernadette McCalliskey, Bernadette Devlin, who we had a bigger effect on, who was a mass leader of the civil rights movement at that stage. So what was raised in that particular struggle was all the legacy in the national question of the right of self-determination, of course, that we linked to the idea of a change in society and a planned economy. And we have to remember that we had a position on the national question that wasn't just linked to Scotland and Ireland, but was an international issue, where, for instance, we had strong and very important contacts in Sri Lanka, in which the national question was a very important part of the struggle of the Sinhalese and the struggle of the Tamils. And also, worldwide, the national question remained incomplete. In Algeria, for instance, in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, there were legacies of the past that were not strictly part of the struggle of the working class and of socialism, but they were incomplete tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution. But it was very sharp in our own case, in the case of Scotland, where a movement began to develop in the 1960s, 1970s, linked to the movement that was developing in Ireland as well. And we made a number of contacts and began to build a strong base. Tony Somwell, who was on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party representing the Young Socialists, also participated in the struggle, for instance, against the H blocks, against what was happening in the H blocks, which were virtually torture changes for prisoners of war resulting from the conflict in Northern Ireland. And by the way, we had a big effect, and Tony had the big effect through the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party in pressing on these demands to get a change in the conditions and for the freedom of people who were entirely innocent of the charges that were made against them. We applied these ideas to Ireland. The incipient national revolts in Ireland were a legacy of the past. Ireland was a vital base for British imperialism. It was a labour reserve of cheap labour, of labourers who came to work in Britain in the factories and some on the land and so on. And we have to remember, because this is important in relation to our position on the national question today, that Marx and Engels supported the independence of Ireland. And by the way, that was our general position on Ireland right up until the 1960s. However, the movement in the 1960s involved a new generation of youth and workers, and that's why I went to Derry, or Londonderry, because they were called both, depending upon which side of the religious divide that you came from. We had a big effect, and we built a base in Ireland, not just in the north, but from there we went to the south, to Dublin, and so on, and we built a powerful position there, which to this day has an effect on the labour movement and the working class. We did not just concentrate on the national question. We linked it to the role of the working class, and this allowed us to clarify our position in relation to Scotland because of the incomplete bourgeois democratic revolution, which involved, of course, independence, the unity of the population, freedom from all the relics of feudalism and so on. We campaigned in both countries for an independent movement of the working class. For instance, in Scotland, it was more of an area of working class struggle than a movement on the national question in the 1960s, a long tradition of militant socialist struggle. In fact, the veins of the British working class ran through Scottish veins with John Maclean, the powerful labour movement and so on. And therefore, we were campaigning mostly on specifically socialist and class demands. Nevertheless, because the national question had not been completed, inevitably the national question came to the fore. Particularly in the last 15, 20 years, we've had a movement of the Scottish people for their national rights, for the setting up of an assembly, which has taken place, and now the question of independence is posed in relation to the struggles in Scotland. And they are very important demands. I mean, for instance, the explosive situation in Scotland today and in the recent past was shown by the movement in and around the Scottish referendum campaign. Remember, the population of Scotland is lower, is less than half of a county, of one county, Yorkshire, in Britain. It's half of London's population at the present time. And yet, despite the propaganda of the British ruling class, of the government, the Tory government at the time, of international capital in the form of Obama, who threatened the Scottish people with retribution if they dared to vote in favour of independence. But nevertheless, they did vote for, not for independence, they came very close, but it was a shock to the ruling class of Britain, to the ruling class of Europe, and to the ruling class of the world. And therefore, that particular event put its stamp on the whole development of the situation in Scotland then and now. For instance, they were terrified, the ruling class, at the vote for independence. Obama actually, threatened Britain or the Scots with all kinds of implications for a run on the currency, for economic punitive measures against the Scottish people itself. This is a little bit of the experience that the Irish people themselves had faced. And yet, there's all kinds of national questions which abound in Europe at the present time. Look at Spain, along with the Catalonia, with the Basque Country and so on. There's a multiplicity of national questions in Europe. And that doesn't say anything about the situation in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. And it's very important in relation to the labour movement today that's inscribed on our banner is this struggle for the right of self-determination, for the oppressed peoples themselves to choose the future, to choose a future and the way that that future will be realised. This multiplicity of national questions cannot be solved except by the working class. The capitalists have come too late onto the scene. They cannot solve the problems of the national question itself. What are these problems? Independence, really, from the economic thrall of capitalism, of an independent development of society. In general, Marx has stood for independence of these countries in the past. In Ireland, for instance, Marx and Engels were for the independence of the working class, not for federation, but they stood for the independence of Ireland, but at the same time understood that little countries, small countries, could not stand by themselves economically. And therefore, the natural tendency would be, if they were to become viable, to link up with stronger economic units. And that's why Marx and Engels stood for independence in Ireland, even though it was smaller than Britain and wasn't really by itself economically viable, but at the same time as independence as a step towards federation. Even the Russian Revolution, as Lenin and Trotsky pointed out, even if the Russian Revolution triumphed and was an advanced industrial country, it could not fulfill the tasks of bringing culture and a growth in the economy to the working class of Russia unless it linked up in some kind of socialist confederation, either with the neighbouring states, and ultimately, really, the solution would only be on the basis of a socialist federation. But the steps towards that would have to be the independence of the Russian people and the different peoples of the Russian Empire, of the former Tsarist Empire itself. And moreover, support for those institutions that reflected the new change in the situation. It seems unbelievable today, but organisations on the left, on the revolutionary left, like the SWP, were opposed to granting the national rights to the Scottish people, such as an assembly. They were opposed to that. They would have been on the wrong side of history. And of course, they didn't have much influence, but with no influence amongst the working class. What the demand for an assembly represented, particularly in the case of Britain, was a rejection of austerity, was a rejection of rule from Edinburgh. If anybody was going to rather rule from London, if anybody was going to rule them, they would have to rule themselves from Edinburgh itself. This book is very good in giving comrades who read it and members of the labour movement an historical idea of the way that the national question developed in Scotland, and it covers many other areas as well. And also, it's very relevant to Wales and Ireland, because Wales will not be far behind Scotland in moving in the direction, not just of devolution, but of demands for independence and the right to govern themselves. In Scotland, militants has a long history of struggles in the labour movement, but particularly on this issue. We opposed the sectarians, who themselves opposed the demand for autonomy, even, not even for independence. And now there is a demand through the Scottish National Party for an independent Scotland itself. A referendum is bound to take place in Scotland at a certain stage. We will give critical support to that referendum for the independence of Scotland if the Scottish people want it, and are likely to want it. But we will demand that an assembly be set up with real powers to change the lives of the Scottish people. For instance, to take over industry, failing capitalism, and to give democratic rights to the working class. I think that it would gain the mass support, not just of those who are supporting independence today, but also the mass of the people of Scotland itself. Really, the national question has some similarities to the land question in an underdeveloped country. If, for instance, we demand land to the peasants, where there is a kind of agricultural situation which is semi-feudal, but the national question cannot be solved under capitalism or even carrying out thorough reforms. You have to link the national question with the first steps, at least, to the idea of cooperatives and ultimately towards the nationalisation of the land. In the case of the national question in Russia, it remains a historical fact that the only government up to now that has granted democracy, the right to secede, freedom of assembly, and all the rest of it, all the other democratic demands of the national question, was the Bolsheviks in 1918 who gave independence to the Finns. But even the Bolsheviks always raised the question that the right of self-determination is correct to demand it, but by itself, no country can establish socialism. There's no such a thing as socialism in one country. It would have to link up in some kind of socialist confederation, a voluntary link-up of Finland with, and that's what was advocated by Lenin and by Trotsky, not by compulsion, but voluntarily, to link up with the working people of Finland itself. Now, just one last word on the national question independently. The national question worldwide is like a ticking time bomb. There's never been a period in history when there's been more examples of national movements demanding their independence. In Africa, there's ticking time bombs throughout the continent. The same, by the way, even in Europe with Belgium, which can split at any time between the different sections of Belgium. Or for instance, Canada, that has a language question in which there could be even a split in Canada, and particularly, of course, in relation to the conflict that inevitably can take place in relation to the USA. Look at the divisions in North America between the USA and between Canada, and even within Canada itself, where there was a referendum where Quebec is a ticking time bomb, and also there's other examples of that throughout the situation in Latin America. In the Russian Revolution, if the Russian Revolution had spread, it could have led to a world socialist federation. That did not develop because of the intervention of the 21 armies of imperialism. But at the same time, Russia has had or had within its near abroad many individual peoples who are disunited at the present time. It's entirely possible if the Russian people carry through the overthrow of this capitalist regime now and establish a democratic socialist confederation in what was Russia in the past, and links that to the idea of bringing together the peoples of the region, you could have a socialist confederation there. But instead of that, look what we have now in Nagorno-Karabakh, with a split, a possibility of further splits of the right of self-determination being replaced by the arbitrary decisions in the conflict between Turkey and between the Nagorno-Karabakh regime. That is split aside again and could also develop in a similar direction in the future. And therefore, comrades, the national question is not some incidental extra. It's part and parcel of the socialist revolution. If the national question is not solved, it will prove to be a running sore that could, under certain circumstances, prevent the revolutions from taking place. And that's why we believe that the revolutions in the different countries, and that's why we say this important book and this important meeting today in Scotland will be one of many that we'll need to produce in order to raise the level of understanding of working people on this question. I repeat, it's not an optional extra. It's not something that we'd like to make a choice of and so on. We could have a major conflict in Scotland in the next period if the SNP becomes the major power in the Assembly, which is likely to take place. The SNP is no longer a radical sounding government or a radical sounding party. It's now a pro-capitalist regime. They cannot solve the problems of the working people. If a referendum takes place, the CWI will advocate that there should be a critical support for independence, but more than that, demanding real powers to change the lives of working people. Wales is a bit behind, but it can catch up with the rest of Britain, and therefore the Assembly in Wales demanding powers to change the lives of working people, I think will be a major issue which will come onto the agenda of the workers' movement in the next period. Support for independence can be raised not just in Scotland, but also in Wales because of the dire economic situation of working people. And therefore, comrades, I would say, a discussion on this issue in and around this important book can serve to strengthen the socialists, and particularly those who profess to be Marxists, as we do, and in that way build a powerful pole of attraction that can attract rather not just workers, but can attract the most oppressed and downtrodden who are under the heel of a dominant national group at the present time, but who long to be free in order to come together in a socialist democratic confederation. Thank you. Thank you.
Just to say thank you for Peter to take the time to make that excellent contribution to this meeting. Really honoured to have that analysis and contribution towards the discussion that we're having this evening in the launch of our new book. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open the discussion up for any questions or comments. So I'll ask you either to raise your hand for people who've used Zoom before, by going into the participants, and then you'll see the little symbol at the bottom says raise hand, and then you can just put that up, or alternatively you can put in the chat that you want to come in. But first of all, I'm just going to bring in, we've got a speaker from Wales, first of all, who's going to just talk a little bit about the Welsh situation, because obviously, as we discussed, as Peter was talking about in his contribution, there was the Welsh national question is not far behind the Scottish situation. So I'm going to hand over to Dave Reid, if he's here. Maybe take a minute to get your camera on. Okay, just give Dave a second just to come and join. There we go. Okay, over to you, Dave.
Well, thanks, Leah. Speaking from Wales, we're delighted to welcome this book launch, because the struggle for Scottish independence will have a huge effect on events in Wales, but also because it shows how Marxists should approach the national question. We're facing a period of turmoil. The terrible social problems arising from the COVID crisis that capitalism and its parties are incapable of solving will inevitably feed into the already existing social and nationalist contradictions. We face a deluge of struggles in these islands, not least the struggle for national and social emancipation in Scotland, but also throughout the rest of these islands as well. And I think the Marxist analysis in this book will allow us to navigate the rapids that are developing without being swept along by the currents one way or another. On the one hand, avoiding a crude opposition to national aspirations, but on the other, not to be swept along with an uncritical support for pro-capitalist nationalism. As Philip has said previously, we have a clear and consistent approach on this question in Scotland and Wales. We don't draw rigid lines between the struggles of the working class to escape austerity and capitalist exploitation, and with the desire for national independence. We don't separate the two struggles, because the struggle for national rights is inseparable from the struggle for socialism, because they're both joined by the fact we're fighting the forces of capitalism and in the UK and internationally. And we think that the growing support for independence is an expression of the desire for social change in society. And so we don't stop at simply demanding national rights or even national independence, but we link it to the idea of a socialist change in society. Now, in Wales, we have a situation where support for independence within the working class has historically been much lower than in Scotland. And that's for a number of economic, historical, geographical, social reasons. And the fact that there are closer ties with England also means that independence does not look as viable or as practical as perhaps it has to the working class in Scotland. For example, in 2014, at the time of the Scottish referendum, when 45% of Scots, a majority of the Scottish working class, voted for independence in the referendum, the support for independence in Wales was as low as 5%. But things have changed now. Support for independence has been as high as 25% in some polls this year. And we think it's likely to rise in the future. Over 40% of 18 to 24-year-olds currently support independence in Wales. 39% of Labour voters, obviously overwhelmingly working class, support independence in Wales. And in this crisis, the COVID crisis, the Welsh Labour government has not been seen as incompetent or as corrupt as the Johnson UK government, or at least until this week. The bungling of the Johnson government has raised the idea that we're better off running our own affairs. That's quite a common theme that's been raised by working people. And that has led to a small growth in support for the Welsh Labour and the Welsh Labour government, but a much bigger rise in support for independence. Now, of course, it's all relative. The reality is that the Welsh government, like the Scottish government, the SNP government in Scotland, has pursued a COVID policy in parallel to the UK Tories in terms of PPE, the attitude to the care homes and the schools and so on. It's been quite similar. And it's also the case that in the last week or so, the Welsh government's COVID strategy has started to unravel. The Welsh government was adamant that schools must remain open right up until the Christmas holidays, until today, when it's been forced into a U-turn that's just as ignominious as Boris Johnson's. But nevertheless, the idea is out there now. And it's not just a simple growth in support for independence. It's a complicated picture in Wales. There's also 20% support for abolition of the Welsh Parliament because of the failure of the Welsh government to protect living standards in the last decade of austerity. It's complicated, but the independence idea is out there, and it started to gain momentum amongst the working class because people see it as a possibility of providing some kind of change from the society that we're living in at the moment. The organisation Yes Cymru, which is the main independence organisation, claims 15,000 members, which would make it the largest political organisation in Wales now that the exit from the Labour Party has followed the Corbyn attacks. And the Tory attacks on devolution using the Brexit legislation from the UK government will add even further to that mood. And that's even before the terrible conditions that are going to be visited on the working class in the economic crisis after this pandemic is finished. And that's going to further intensify the disillusionment with the British establishment settlement and therefore the existence of the UK itself. So the Socialist Party Wales position for autonomy, Devo Max, is still the most popular option. It has the support of 59% of those who expressed a preference in the last opinion poll. We call for a Welsh Parliament with full lawmaking and tax relieving powers, the power to nationalise companies like Ford Bridgend, who have closed their plant and left the country, or Tata Steel that threatens the same. We think the Welsh Parliament should have the power to nationalise those companies, and also the power to outlaw things like zero-hour contracts. But we don't stick to rigid formulations. Our programme has changed from the 1979 referendum in Scotland. If the movement grows for independence and gains further traction amongst the working class in Wales, then we will develop our position to reflect the social movement that will exist around the campaign for independence in Wales too. The enormous struggle in Scotland for the right to hold a referendum, the right for national self-determination, will also have a huge effect on boosting support for that idea in Wales as well. So we will work alongside Socialist Party Scotland to arm this movement with a socialist content. And this book will help to arm our struggle as well, to provide a socialist alternative. We have different movements in different countries at different stages of development, but we have one slogan that encapsulates our position for a voluntary confederation, a voluntary socialist confederation of Wales, Scotland, England and Ireland. We can be justly proud of the consistent position that the CWI have held on the national question, but our intervention on this question is just beginning. The Marxists will play a crucial role in this struggle, and that will not end until the socialist transformation of society.
Thank you, Dave. That was excellent. Always good to hear what's happening in Wales and the sort of similarities and lessons that can be learnt from our analysis on the national question. I'm just going to say at this point, thanks to all our Facebook Live people who joined us this evening, but we're going to switch that off just now.